In front of Golden Acres, Esme's home, I rested my hand on the iron gate, in which vines and metal foliage entwined, convoluted as a thought. Before Esme, these rolling hills were brown in the summer, green in the winter, gently dotted with oaks. They were where my imagination took flight, and where my fancy allowed me to portray any character and partake in any adventure I deemed fit. One thicket, one California oak in particular, became my home, until it was uprooted to create the building lot for this house. I promised that day to hate the family that moved here, and then I met Esme. And yes, at first perhaps it was curiosity that drew me to her, and the glitter of the rich. But then I got to know Esme, to love Esme, to love reading on warm afternoons by the open windows of Golden Acres, drenched in sun, with our legs entwined. Esme loved everything about the house, its fairyland turrets, its paintwork which shone like the icing on a wedding cake, the fretwork and finials she'd chosen herself from a catalogue. Esme loved best how the light spilled from the windows at night, so it looked like a giant doll's house. Now the windows were dark and shuttered, and the spindly cutwork over the porch looked like cobwebs in the twilight, as I stood trembling, fearing that I would entangle myself in my own web. I put my hand to my mouth to stop my lip from quivering, and in doing so brushed up against the long row of black glass buttons on my bodice. I gripped one, and then the next, letting my fingers close on the cold surface of each in turn, following them up from my breast to my neck. Once more in my mind, I chanted my own rosary, Lord, give me strength. At the touch of the last button, I swung open the gate and crossed the threshold into Golden Acres. My footsteps rang out sharply like the rap of a hammer on coffin nails. I sped up along the new, perfectly manicured brick path, ran up the steps of the porch, and rang the bell cord. No one would answer anyway, I told myself, as I withdrew my hand. Mr. McBride was with the search party. Mrs. McBride would be waiting, perhaps pacing, in her morning room at the back of the house. I immediately despised myself. Wasn't this truly what I hoped for, that she would not let me in? Feet clattered through the entrance hall almost instantly. I stepped back in surprise as the porch flickered with red, orange, and green from a solitary oil lamp, carried inside, casting its light through the stained glass window above the door. My face flared with heat. Of course, Esme's father would never abandon his wife at a time like this. Friends would be visiting, Reverend Carmichael offering platitudes, and Molly Cartwright, of all people I dreaded most. Molly, checking in on her constantly. More tea, Mo. Mrs. McBride ran on tea like an engine needed steam. I turned to run, but stopped myself by grabbing the rail of the porch. Behind me, the door was unlatched. A ray of light overtook me down the path. Rose? It was Molly. Molly, as she'd been called at school. Is that you? She sounded as terrified as I felt. Have you news? Charlie and the search party? I leaned over as fear and nausea grasped my stomach. I dare not face her. Rose? This time she did not stutter. Mrs. McBride is in torment. If you know anything, she said, I must be told. Her voice was infused with command and yet desperation too. Even if you've only come to offer comfort. I was stunned. She put her hands on her hips and said again, her voice crisp and insistent, what business have you, Violet? I've no news, Molly. I've not heard from the men. You've not spoken to Charlie, she interrupted. To no one. I took a deep breath. But I must speak to Mrs. McBride if she's able to see me. She'll welcome you, Violet, she said, her tone not welcoming at all. She opened the door wider and waited, as still as a garden statue. Thank you, I muttered as I stepped across the porch. Thank you, as I passed her. Thank you, as I walked into the house, bobbing my head as if it were I, not Molly, who was the servant. She closed the door behind me. Mrs. McBride was already hurrying across the entrance hall, small and round as a spool of thread unravelling. Her eyes were red and puffy, her face grey. Beneath her dress, her ill-fitting corset showed in a line across her chest, rising and falling with every jagged breath. I gasped at the sight of her, so distressed, so undone. But it was Molly who went to meet her first, stepping past me to take Mrs. McBride's hands into her own. So to my surprise, they stood facing each other for a moment, until Molly left round the back of the main stairs. No word was exchanged, but I felt the sorrow in the gesture to be as stifling as a September heatwave. I stammered out a word of greeting, unclear and muddled. Mrs. McBride moved towards me, her hands outstretched, her eyebrows rising into her meticulously curled hairline. I knew what she wanted to hear, what she longed to be true. "Forgive me, Mrs. McBride." I dropped into a sort of curtsy, eyes cast to the ground. "I've no news, but I needed to come. I needed to tell you." My hands trembled as I held them out to meet hers. I avoided her eyes, but I was determined to speak. I opened my mouth again, but all I could say was, "I'm sorry, I am so, so sorry." I grasped at a hall chair by the wall, and a howl, raw as a coyote yelp, burst from me. "Forgive me." I sank to the floor. The wood-panelled entrance hall disappeared. I saw only the dwindling of light and heard only the sound of my black silk skirt rustling like dead leaves as I rocked to and fro. "Violet, Violet Rose," Mrs. McBride's plump red apple hand grasped my forearm and shook me gently. "Rose, look at me." She leaned over and stroked my cheek. "Look at me, child." She pulled me to my feet, all the while gazing into my eyes, repeating, "Rose, my dear, it wasn't your fault. I understand, I understand." "But you don't." An icy chill passed right through my body. I must tell her. I must. For a moment, some part of myself, my mind or my soul, left my body and hovered over us. The feeling was one of total peace, all my worries and burdens gone. But no sooner had I thought this than my heart raced, my chest heaved, and I was overwhelmed with the memory of Esme that I'd fought to escape. Esme's face, Esme's foot at the edge of the cliff, the gull screeching as it hovered over us like the spirit of God over the abyss, the unutterable speed and power of the wave, and my mind shouting where my lips could not even stutter, that if she would come back to me now, all would be well. Even if she were to marry Tom, even if she were to be separated, all would be well, because for now she would be back in my arms, and I could smooth her hair and put my cheek against hers to dry her skin. "Rose!" Mrs. McBride put her hand on my shoulder. I flinched, opened my mouth to speak, and my words were drowned by an urgent, bestial hammering upon the front door. "Good heavens, Molly!" Mrs. McBride called. Molly was already at the door, as if she had been waiting just around the corner. She flung it open and Charlie staggered in, his jacket ripped, his pants stained white with salt water, the smell of sweat and leather clinging to him in the blast of the cold night air. He held before him in his shaking hand a string of buttons. Molly grabbed him by the shoulders and then sprang back as if remembering her place, her hands clamped against the open door. He stared at her, and then at us, tears brimming in his eyes. He tried to speak, failed, and bent down to rest his hands on his knees, retching for breath. Outside, the horse snorted and pawed the ground. Then he looked up again and shook his head. Mrs. McBride screamed. I choked, and then we held on to each other, hardly hearing what Charlie had to say through our cries. "Mrs. McBride, Mum, I'm sorry. We found her on the beach." Mrs. McBride grasped my hand. Her nails dug sharp against my palm as I looked into Charlie's haunted face. He held out Esme's charm string. "She had this, Mum, in her..." His voice wavered. "Here." He gestured to his chest, and his face told me how the men must have ripped her bodice open to give her space to breathe. Must have pressed on her ribs to empty her lungs of water, how they mauled and pummeled her for the faintest hope of life. He looked sick and glanced away. Mr. McBride asked I would show you, so you would know. A drop of water fell to the floor as the buttons clicked and quivered in the air. I saw the glint of cut steel facets that would rust now, and the rough edges of glass buttons smashed in the waves. I wanted to take the string and hold it gently in my hands. I wanted to mend the beauty destroyed. I wanted to stop time and change everything that I had done, unravel and reorder the string. I wanted Esme back, but I could not. We all stood in silence, the truth untold, like a prison, until Mrs. McBride said, quite simply, "She is dead."